A few people have suggested this case, and I want to thank them for their recommendation. This includes Ian No One, Topskek, Ian Dorr, and Shisha87. Got there in the end. Now on with the video. The Snowtown murders involved the killing of 12 people between 1992 and 1999 in Australia by a group which included Robert Wagner and James Vlassakis, and the ringleader being a man called John Bunting. Bunting, a former abattoir worker, was a sadistic psychopath who would target people at random to be eliminated due to them being suspected of being paedophiles, being homosexual, or for any other reason he concocted to enable him to torture and murder other human beings. Bunting would get his victims to call him, quote, Lord and Sir, and liked to look into his victims' eyes when they were murdered. None of the perpetrators or victims were from Snowtown, which has become synonymous with this case, and only one of the murders occurred here. But this is the place where the 7-year crime spree came to an end, when the dismembered bodies of 8 people were found in 6 barrels of acid stored in a disused bank vault in the town. This is a story of absolute depravity, and is, by number of victims, the worst serial killing case in Australian history. Welcome to Evil Among Us. This story begins with John Justin Bunting, the leader of the group of murderers responsible for the horrors in this case. He was born on the 4th of September 1966 in the suburb of Inala in the city of Brisbane, which is the capital of the state of Queensland in the northeast of Australia. Bunting has claimed that on one occasion when he was around 8 years old, he was sexually and physically abused by a friend's older brother, which led him to develop a lifelong hatred of paedophiles. Also during his childhood, Bunting is known to have killed animals. He started small, spending a lot of his childhood dropping insects into acid and watching them dissolve. As he became a teenager, Bunting escalated his behaviour to torturing, killing and skinning cats, revelling in their pain as they died. By the time that John Bunting was around 13 years old, he was a fervent homophobe and racist. He bought a copy of Mein Kampf and read it cover to cover, began to idolise Adolf Hitler, going to the point where he spray painted a large swastika on the side of his car. He also joined a neo-Nazi gang, and association with similarly bigoted people inevitably led to his prejudicial views being compounded, and it appears expanded to those with mental and physical disabilities, drug users, and essentially anyone who he considered inferior, or those who simply annoyed him. John Bunting develops an internal quote-unquote code of those who he deemed worthy of elimination, but, as will be shown, this was often on the flimsiest of evidence and was extremely fluid. Essentially, John Bunting was a very dangerous man, and simply being in his orbit meant you were risking your life, as, at any moment, you may have violated his code and end up being tortured and butchered by a man who had no empathy and no remorse for his actions. Bunting's chosen professions appear to be an extension of his emerging fascination with death. At the age of 20, he got a job in a crematorium and seemed to really enjoy the task of destroying human bodies. At the age of 22, he got a job at the South Australian Meat Corporation, a job he absolutely enjoyed as he was involved in the slaughtering of the animals. He would brag to his co-workers about how many animals he'd killed on any given day. Bunting was, by all accounts, charming and friendly, and this made him even more dangerous. He walked through life undetected as the dangerous psychopath he was. Behind the scenes, his animal cruelty continued unabated, including him killing and skinning a friend's dog. In private, John Bunting had a fascination with weapons and anatomy. He would read books, learning the best way to dismember and dispose of human remains. Bunting kept his darker side hidden and was able to form and maintain both friendships and intimate relationships, although these always appeared to be characterised by a power imbalance. For example, in January 1993, Bunting met an 18-year-old woman called Veronica Tripp, who married just 8 months later. An important detail about Veronica is that she had significant intellectual disabilities and had the mental capacity of a child. She would, years later, when giving evidence in court about Bunting, do so whilst cuddling a teddy bear. The reason I highlight this is because John Bunting surrounding himself with and targeting those who are vulnerable in some way is a repeating theme. Veronica would later state that after she married Bunting, so essentially when she was trapped, he showed his true colours and she was terrified of him. She claimed not to have been physically abused by him, but was the victim of verbal abuse, a witness to his explosive temper, to the point where, when she discovered details of some of the murders, she kept this to herself for years, for fear that she would become one of the victims. John Bunting committed his first murder when he was 26 years old, but it's clear that by his early 20s, He was a ticking time bomb, a man whose life, up to that point, had been about sadistic acts of violence towards animals and the enjoyment from killing living things. A man who had begun researching how to dismember human beings and who had developed a code which enabled him to justify the elimination of anyone who he considered inferior, with him having no empathy for others and no remorse for his actions. John Bunting stood at just 5 feet 4 inches tall as an adult, and potentially his stature led many to underestimate him, and this, coupled with his ability to charm and manipulate others, meant he operated undetected for years and was able to recruit willing volunteers to help him engage in a killing spree, which I've no doubt he'd been fantasizing about for years. And in 1992, the horror that would become known as the Snowtown murders would begin. The Snowtown murders resulted in the deaths of 12 people and occurred over the course of 7 years. Different people were involved in the various murders, with John Bunting, as the years progressed, recruiting people to his cause. The association between the victims and perpetrators often overlap, and some who initially helped Bunting became victims themselves. I'll try to lay out the horror in this case as simply as I can. So the first person to be recruited by John Bunting was a man named Robert Joe Wagner. He was born on the 28th of November 1971 in the city of Parramatta in the state of New South Wales. Wagner's childhood seems to have been characterised by abuse, with him being the victim of a prolific paedophile called Barry Wayne Lane, who, in 1984, when Wagner was 13 years old, groomed him and then began to molest him. Wagner's parents apparently tried to stop the abuse, and, as a response, Barry essentially kidnapped Wagner, and in 1985, the pair went into hiding for the next 4 years, only re-emerging in late 1989 when Robert Wagner was 18 years old. The pair could live openly as a gay couple. However, they were constantly harassed, as Barry had a history of molesting children, and no one wanted him in the area. What Wagner must have gone through the years of being in the clutches of this paedophile cannot be understated. In 1991, Barry Lane and Robert Wagner were living, apparently in a relationship, at 1 Bingham Road in Salisbury North in Greater Adelaide, when John Bunting and his wife Veronica moved into 203 Waterloo Corner Road, a property approximately 200 metres away. How Bunting and Wagner actually met is unclear, but they were soon spending the majority of their time together. It appears that Bunting believed that Wagner was not actually gay, and that instead he'd been ground down by years of abuse by Barry to believe this. The men bonded over their shared hatred of paedophiles and homosexuals, and their admiration of Nazism. It's reported that both of the men were part of at least one right-wing group, and attended meetings together, before being expelled because their views were too extreme. Over time, John Bunting became close friends with both Robert Wagner and somewhat inexplicably Barry Lane. Barry was the epitome of everything Bunting apparently hated. He was gay and a paedophile. However, it appears that he was useful to Bunting. He would identify men in the local area that were gay, many being friends of his. He would also specifically point out which ones were allegedly paedophiles. In this respect, Bunting tolerated Barry because he was a necessary evil, a way to compile a kill list, but, behind his back, he would refer to him as, quote, dirty. One of Barry Lane's friends was a man called Clinton Trezise, who was unapologetic about his sexuality. He was known to people in the area as someone who would often be seen walking around in bright red and purple trousers, leading to Bunting calling him, quote, happy pants. This was not a term of endearment, and would be something he would say mockingly to Clinton. It seems that Clinton knew Bunting through his association with Barry Lane and Robert Wagner, as he would often spend time at their property. There's little information about Clinton. This is due to how isolated he was. He was apparently estranged from his family and had few friends. I've also read that he had intellectual disabilities, but, despite this, he was a happy, although apparently vulnerable young man. There's no evidence that Clinton had ever harmed a child. However, this didn't stop Bunting determining that he was a paedophile. He used his association with Barry Lane to get information about Clinton and to form a friendship with him, which was solely to get close to his target. The friendship was strong enough that on August 31st, 1992, John Bunting invited Clinton round to his home at Waterloo Corner Road, and whilst he sat on the sofa, Bunting approached him from behind and hit Clinton several times on the head with either a shovel or a hammer, fracturing his skull and killing him. An autopsy would later show that Clinton had a broken hand, indicating that he'd put it on his head to try and fend off some of the blows, so he knew he was going to die. When Bunting was sure that Clinton was dead, he wrapped his body in bin bags and summoned the help of Robert Wagner and Barry Lane to help him move the body. Barry offered the use of his station wagon, and Clinton's body was loaded into the back. They drove around 30 miles north of Adelaide to an isolated patch of farmland, where Clinton's body was stripped of its clothing and then dumped in a shallow grave. His body was not found until August 16, 1994, almost 2 years later, when farmers ploughing the field came across his final resting place. What is so sad with this murder is how no one noticed or potentially cared that Clinton had gone missing. The only supposed friends that Clinton had were the ones involved in killing him and disposing of his body, and he was not reported missing by his family until late 1995, 3 years after his murder. A picture of Clinton was sent to police in 1995. It was only using this, comparing it to the skull that had been found, that they could identify the remains of a John Doe that had been found a year before. Immediately after the murder of Clinton, John Bunting, Robert Wagner and Barry Lane went back to Bunting's home to celebrate murdering a man they claimed to be a paedophile. Whilst Bunting and Wagner were buzzing, Barry was disturbed by what he'd seen and been involved in. I think at this point it dawned on him just how dangerous Bunting was. Barry told his mother and Bunting's wife Veronica Tripp about the murder of Clinton. Veronica asked Bunting whether this was true. He confirmed that it was, but he swore her to secrecy, and she kept this to herself until years later, at her husband's trial. Bunting didn't kill again for over 3 years, but he wasn't idle during this time. He created what was described in court as a, quote, rock spider wall. This is due to the fact that in Australia, child sex offenders are sometimes called rock spiders. This was set up on a wall in Bunting's home, and was a set of paper notes connected by lengths of wool, which identified people who Bunting claimed were paedophiles. Bunting would frequently select a name from the wall, call them, and threaten their lives, as well as vandalising their homes and vehicles. As well as this, in the years between the first and second murders, John Bunting was recruiting others to his cause. However, some of these people, when they were no longer of use, would become victims. The third main figure in these crimes is a man called James Spryden Vlassakis, who was born on December 24th, 1979. He's important in this case, not just because of his involvement, but the details he provided during his subsequent confessions, which gives a real insight into the workings of the group, as well as their methods and motives. Vlassakis' childhood was nothing short of horrific. His father, a man named Spiros, was a violent dictator in the home and would regularly beat his wife, Elizabeth Harvey, and for years sexually abused not only Vlassakis, but also his older half-brother, Troy Ude. It's unclear whether Elizabeth knew what Spiros was doing, but it appears she had her own difficulties, including an addiction to gambling, meaning that she was often out, leaving the children in a home of absolute horror. The abuse came to an end suddenly when Spiros died of a heart attack when Vlassakis was around 10 or 11 years old. However, the abuse then began again when Troy Ude, likely replicating the behaviour of his father, began to regularly rape Vlassakis. Things only got worse when, in November 1993, so when Vlassakis was 13 years old, Elizabeth was approached by a neighbour called Jeffrey Payne, who offered to help and spend time with the boys. This included not only Vlassakis and Troy Ude, but also 2 other children called Adrian and Christopher. Elizabeth was struggling to cope as a single mother, and so agreed. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Payne was a convicted paedophile, and as soon as he got access to the children, he began raping each of them, threatening to kill them if they told their mother. This went on for 2 months until January 1994, when Barry Lane, who we've already met, knocked on Elizabeth's door and told her that Payne was a paedophile. So essentially one child molester was outing another one. Payne immediately fled the area, but the damage had already been done. So by the age of 13 years old, James Vlassakis had been sexually abused by at least 3 people. It's clear he suffered from severe PTSD as a result of this abuse, and he began to self-medicate, using heroin from a young age to block out his trauma. In April 1994, still when he was only 13 years old, Elizabeth Harvey began a relationship with John Bunting. It's reported in some articles they got married, but I cannot see that this is the case. Instead, it seems as though whilst married to Veronica Tripp, Bunting was involved in several sexual relationships with various women, including Elizabeth. Regardless, Bunting being in a relationship with Elizabeth brought him into contact with Vlassakis, a child desperate for acceptance and a male role model. Elizabeth was enamoured with Bunting, and Vlassakis later recalled, quote, "When I first met John, he was so polite, so well spoken, so well mannered." Bunting quickly took on a parental role, being 28 years old by this point, 15 years older than Vlassakis, and their relationship began normally enough. They would go to the cinema and ride motorcycles together, but Bunting quickly began the grooming process. Bunting was still in the habit of torturing, killing and skinning cats and dogs in the local area, and on several occasions he did this in front of Vlassakis and eventually got him to be involved in this behaviour. Also, Bunting showed his young protege the wall he'd created in his home with information about men in the area he suspected of being paedophiles. Bunting referred to these men as, quote, dirty, and like Robert Wagner before him, James Vlassakis was privy to Bunting's rantings about his hatred of these types of people. In December 1995, John Bunting found a perfect target for his homicidal urges, and this came in the form of a 26-year-old man called Ray Davies. Ray was a vulnerable young man with intellectual disabilities, who, in 1993, began a relationship with a woman called Suzanne Allen, who was a former girlfriend of John Bunting. The relationship came to an end quickly when Suzanne's grandsons accused Ray of making sexual advances towards them. Whilst the relationship ended, the pair stayed on good terms, and Ray stayed in a caravan at the rear of Suzanne's property. Christmas Day 1995, Suzanne was spending Christmas with her daughter, Annette Cannon, the mother of the children that Ray was accused of trying to molest. During the celebrations, one of the children stated that Ray had sexually assaulted them, and so the family left to go and report this to the police. Ray Davies was already on John Bunting's radar, due to it being reported that he would sometimes be found masturbating whilst hidden in bushes as young girls walked past. Due to this latest incident, inevitably disclosed to him by Suzanne Allen, Bunting decided that Ray needed to die. On the 25th of December 1995, whilst the family were out, John Bunting and Robert Wagner went to Ray's caravan, dragged him out, handcuffed him, and bundled him into Wagner's car. He was then driven over 90 miles away to a property which Bunting was renting, in a place called Baccarat. Here, Ray was tortured, including being beaten over the head with metal poles. Part of this was to extract his bank information. Ray Davies, by this point battered and bruised but still alive, was driven back and ended up in John Bunting's home at 203 Waterloo Corner Road. Here, he continued to be tortured by both Bunting and Wagner, but apparently also present and involved was James Vlassakis' mother, Elizabeth Harvey. What happened next is unclear. It's reported that all three took turns beating Ray, with Elizabeth potentially stabbing him up and down his legs with a knife. Jump cables were then placed around Ray's neck, and he was strangled to death. From reports of court proceedings, it appears that Robert Wagner was the man who finally ended Ray Davies' life. Whilst James Vlassakis was not present during this murder, both Wagner and Bunting soon told him about killing Ray Davies. John Bunting also told him about the murder of Clinton Trezise in 1992. The men laughed when talking about the murders, and in 1997, after the body of Clinton had been identified, he was the focus of a segment on Australia's Most Wanted, with the programme asking for information. With glee, Bunting pointed at the screen and said, quote, "That's my handiwork." The next person to die was Suzanne Allen. I firmly believe Suzanne was murdered, but at court, the jury was undecided, so no one was convicted for involvement in her death. However, I'll leave it to you to decide. Suzanne Allen is someone we've already mentioned. She was 47 years old in 1996, and, despite John Bunting being married to Veronica Tripp and in a sexual relationship with Elizabeth Harvey, he was also sleeping with Suzanne. However, by mid-1996, Bunting had tired of Suzanne, but she was unable to accept the relationship was over. She would send him notes and drive past his property, much to Bunting's annoyance. Sometime in November 1996, Suzanne died in her home. How is unclear. Bunting would later claim she suffered a fatal heart attack in the bathroom. Bunting later told Vlassakis that he and Wagner were involved in a, quote, slice and dice, with them placing Suzanne's body in the bath, where they proceeded to skin it and cut it into 11 pieces. The men were clearly enjoying themselves. At one point, Wagner apparently held out Suzanne's severed head and tried to get Bunting to kiss it. Her body parts were then wrapped in plastic bags and buried on top of the remains of Ray Davies in the backyard of 203 Waterloo Corner Road. After her death, Bunting continued to collect Suzanne's unemployment benefits and also stripped her home of belongings and sold them. On December the 10th, 1996, Suzanne's brother reported her to the police as missing. They contacted her last known boyfriend, John Bunting, who, by this point, had redirected her mail to his home, making it look as though she'd moved there. When police attended, Bunting said Suzanne had been there, but had moved out, and told him that she didn't want to be contacted by anyone, not even her family. Given that her benefits were still being drawn out, and finding Bunting's story plausible, the police decided that Suzanne had, for whatever reason, decided to move away and break contact with her family, so the case was closed. Robert Bunting collected Suzanne's benefits between 1996 and 1999 and would provide various addresses to the benefits agency to make it seem like Suzanne was moving around, to make it appear to both them and the police, if they looked into the case, that she was still alive. By the end of 1996, Robert Wagner and Barry Lane had separated. This had occurred after Barry had again been accused of molesting a child in the local area, and the house they shared had been firebombed. This gave Wagner the chance to escape the relationship, and he then declared that he was not homosexual and began a relationship with a woman who we'll call Kate, who he soon became engaged to. Kate had children from a previous relationship, and Wagner quickly established himself as a father figure within the home. After several years of association with John Bunting, Robert Wagner was now fully committed to his cause and would enthusiastically espouse violent and hateful rhetoric about gay people, people of colour, and paedophiles to anyone who would listen. Unfortunately, in 1997, 19-year-old Michael Gardner would become the focus of both Bunting and Wagner's fury. He was homosexual and a friend of Kate, Wagner's now fiancée, and would regularly come round to play with her children. Wagner apparently tolerated Michael due to Kate, but Bunting instantly took a dislike to him, referring to him as, quote, the biggest homo. However, one incident sealed his fate. Specifically in early September 1997, whilst playing with the children, Michael grabbed hold of one of them and placed his hand over their mouth to stop them talking. It appears that this was a playful gesture, but was seen by Robert Wagner, who was incensed. Wagner apparently found this triggering, as he, as a child, had had a similar thing done to him whilst he was being sexually abused. Wagner contacted Bunting, and they both determined that Michael Gardner was a paedophile and he deserved to die. To be clear, there's no evidence that Michael was a paedophile. On the evening of the 10th of September 1997, Michael Gardner was at the home he shared with his friend Nicole on Moffin Road in Adelaide. Nicole was away on business, and so Robert Wagner and John Bunting knew he was alone. They drove to the property and ambushed Michael, forcing him into a vehicle where he was handcuffed, and then driven 60 miles to 3 Burdekin Avenue, Murray Bridge, a property that Bunting had moved to a few months before. Here, Michael was violently beaten by both men and tortured. His body, when it was eventually recovered, showed that he had been burnt all over his body, most likely with lit cigarettes, with the most severe burns being found to his scrotum. The torture appears to have been used primarily to extract his banking information from him. Eventually, after suffering hours of torture, Michael Gardner was taken into the garage adjoining the property and a noose placed around his neck. The end of the rope was placed over a beam in the ceiling and pulled so that Michael had to stand on his tiptoes to keep from strangling. Whilst fighting to stay upright, Michael had a phone held to his ear. He was told to tell the person on the end of the phone, a friend of his, he was going to move up north. This friend asked why, and the line went dead. Having put in place the first part of their plan to cover their tracks, John Bunting and Robert Wagner sat and watched the badly injured Michael struggle to stay upright. Eventually his strength failed him, and he couldn't stay standing any longer, and Michael Gardner strangled to death. Wagner and Bunting then returned to Michael's home, which he shared with his friend Nicole, and they ransacked the place, including taking property belonging to her, and then forging a note apparently from Michael, apologising for the theft and saying he needed the money for his move up north. Over the next few weeks, Nicole got a number of phone calls from 2 men, one who claimed to be a friend of Michael, and another who claimed to be Michael himself. The supposed friend wanted Michael's wallet sent to him. This was because it had been left at the property by accident, and Bunting needed it to get access to the benefits payments. Nicole told this man that if Michael wanted this, he should come and get it himself. The male became abusive and hung up. On another occasion, a man called who claimed to be Michael. Nicole instantly knew this wasn't the voice of her friend. This man reiterated that Michael had left, apparently to go and get a sex change. James Vlassakis later stated that he was present during one of these phone calls, which were made by a man that had been convinced to do so by John Bunting. Michael Gardner was the first victim to end up in a barrel. This was a 44-gallon plastic barrel bought by John Bunting, to store the bodies of his victims, which was then filled with hydrochloric acid to dissolve the remains. The barrel was stored in the shed at his property. A further 7 people end up in another 5 identical barrels, including someone we've already mentioned, Barry Lane, who had been murdered less than 2 months after Michael Gardner. As already stated, Barry Lane, by this point aged 42 years old, had separated from Robert Wagner in 1996. Like Wagner, he'd begun a relationship with a woman and proposed to her, and used this as evidence to tell people that he wasn't homosexual. However, it's been argued, and I would agree, that this was a calculated move by Barry to try to avoid the wrath of Bunting by pretending that he was no longer homosexual. In fact, looking at his behaviour, it appears that all of Barry's actions were calculated to try and stay on Bunting's good side. He provided evidence on other paedophiles, warned Elizabeth Harvey that her children were being abused, and even helped dispose of the body of Clinton. Due to his relationship with Robert Wagner breaking down, I think that Barry felt he'd lost an element of protection, and so needed to try and claim that he was not gay. However, the woman that Barry had begun a relationship with had children, and when the authorities became involved, the coupling ended. Barry then gave up the facade, and in April 1997, he invited a disturbed young man, 18-year-old Thomas Trevelyan, to live with him. Thomas had a history of mental health issues and was likely schizophrenic. He had intense fancies about serving in the armed forces and would constantly dress in military uniforms and fatigues. He was known to be violent and would often walk around brandishing a knife in response to voices and noises he heard. It's recorded that Thomas had threatened Barry, and this was due to the latter's sexual advances. Although he was gay and a paedophile, Barry was killed, it would appear, primarily because he told several people about the murder of Clinton Trezise. He needed to be silenced before word got back to the police. On October the 17th, 1997, John Bunting and Robert Wagner broke into Barry Lane's property. Thomas Trevelyan was there, but it's not known whether he was involved in the planning of this murder. Barry was handcuffed and bound to a chair. He was then beaten into giving his debit card PIN number. He was then made to assist in covering up his own murder, and was forced to call his mother at around 11 PM. This call was at the instigation of Bunting, and Barry was told to tell his mother that he wanted nothing more to do with her, and that he was moving to Queensland and would not be coming back. Barry's mother heard Thomas Trevelyan shouting in the background, encouraging Barry to be as spiteful as possible to his mother. Barry was also forced to call his brother and convey the same story. With the men feeling confident that they covered their tracks, Barry was gagged and his head bound with tape. A pair of pliers were then used to crush his toes. Eventually, the 3 got bored of Barry's muffled screams, and he was strangled to death, with a length of flex, apparently by Robert Wagner. His body was left on the floor of his home and the 3 men left. They returned several days later to clean up the scene. They also killed Barry's pet dogs and cats. His body was then moved and dismembered at a separate location, and eventually placed in the same acid-filled barrel as the remains of Michael Gardner, whose foot was cut off in order for the lid to be closed. Barry's disability benefits continued to be paid, and were taken out of his account by Wagner. John Bunting took ownership of Barry Lane's truck and quickly swapped it for another vehicle, telling people he bought it from him. The police did look into the disappearance of Barry Lane, but the case quickly went cold. With Barry Lane dead, Thomas Trevelyan had served his purpose. His body was found by police on November the 5th, 1997, hanging from a tree in the town of Kersbrook in the Adelaide Hills. Due to his mental health difficulties, which included a history of self-harm and suicide attempts, Thomas's death was ruled a suicide. However, he'd been murdered. Bunting later told James Vlassakis that because Thomas began to, quote, fuck up and go mental, he needed to be eliminated. Specifically, he'd begun telling everyone about the murder of Barry Lane, although many people thought this was part of his hallucinations. On the date of his death, John Bunting and Robert Wagner invited Thomas to go on a drive with them. In the vehicle was a box and a length of rope with a noose at one end. When they got to Kersbrook, Thomas was forced to stand on the box and the noose was placed around his neck. The box was then kicked away and Thomas Trevelyan strangled to death. Gavin Allen Porter was a 31-year-old man and another vulnerable male in this story. He was a paranoid schizophrenic who spent many years in and out of mental health facilities. He was also a drug addict, and after moving to Adelaide from Victoria in 1997, he soon met James Vlassakis. The pair became friends, bonding over their use of heroin. In late 1997, Vlassakis, his mother and his siblings moved to live with James Bunting at 3 Burdekin Avenue, Murray Bridge, and Gavin moved with them, although it seems while he spent time during the day in the home, he slept outside in his car. Remember, this was a property with 2 dead bodies in a barrel in a shed in the garden. Why Bunting allowed Gavin to spend time in the property is unclear. He despised him and believed that he was a waste of space due to his drug addiction. Sometime in April 1998, John Bunting was pricked by a used needle left by Gavin on the sofa, and he was apoplectic and decided that he needed to die. On the date of his death, which was a few days after the needle incident, James Vlassakis went to a drive-in movie, and when he came back, he saw John Bunting and Robert Wagner in Gavin's car, apparently cleaning up. Vlassakis was then shown Gavin's body in the shed, which showed the imprint of a ligature mark on his neck. Bunting and Wagner had attacked Gavin when he was asleep in his car. He'd grabbed a screwdriver and managed to stab Bunting in the hand before being overpowered and strangled to death with the length of cord. Gavin's body lay on the shed floor for a number of days, whilst Bunting obtained another barrel and filled it with acid. With this accomplished, Vlassakis helped Bunting put Gavin's body in the barrel, and it was sealed. Whilst disposing of Gavin, Bunting opened the first barrel, looked in, and said, quote, "They're rotting very nicely." I now need to introduce the last person in this web of evil, a man named Mark Ray Hayden, who was born on December the 4th, 1958. Hayden was described as a shy and withdrawn child, whose mother used to abuse him both physically and mentally. He grew up socially isolated and had a few friends. He and John Bunting met in the late 1980s when they both attended a welding course, and they soon became inseparable. Hayden was privy to many conversations between John Bunting and Robert Wagner about their crimes, so he was fully aware of what these men were up to and how dangerous they were. Hayden married a woman called Elizabeth in February 1996, and after this point, he separated himself from the group. However, by 1998, and prior to the murder of the 8th victim, he'd reunited with his co-defendants. I don't have much information about Hayden's character as an adult, but, as you'll see, he was clearly as twisted as his associates. 21-year-old Troy Yude was the 8th victim of the group, and was the first murder which James Vlassakis participated in. Troy Yude was, as mentioned earlier in this video, the half-brother of Vlassakis, who'd apparently raped him when the pair were children. Early in his relationship with Bunting, Vlassakis had told him about this abuse, and Bunting had responded by saying that Troy needed to die. However, despite this, as with other victims, Bunting and Troy had been associating for years, and he was, at the time of his death, living with Bunting and Vlassakis. Why the group decided to kill Troy at this point is unknown, but this was clearly a pre-planned murder. The exact date of his death is unclear, but it was likely the 25th of August 1998. In preparation, Robert Wagner had come to 3 Burdekin Avenue, Murray Bridge, along with Mark Hayden, and they'd both armed themselves with hammers. They crept into the room where Troy was sleeping and attacked him, beating him, and when he woke up, he was quickly tied up and handcuffed and dragged into the bathroom. Vlassakis said it was at this point that he was woken up and told that he needed to come, as they were about to kill Troy. Vlassakis went into the bathroom and found his badly beaten half-brother now in the bathtub. Troy was further beaten and Bunting used pliers to crush his toes, whilst demanding that he repeat a string of numbers, words and sentences that were recorded and which would later be spliced together to create a message which could be played down the phone to others to explain his absence. This method of torture was also used to extract his bank information, including his PIN number. Troy was made to refer to the men who were about to murder him by various titles, including quote Lord and Sir. In particular, Bunting demanded to be called quote God, Master and Chief Inspector. John Bunting went close to Troy's face and recounted the names of the people he'd murdered so far, no doubt wishing to see the terror in his latest victim's eyes, knowing he would now be added to that list. A rope was then placed around Troy's neck, and a jackhammer was inserted into the rope to act as a twisting mechanism. The hammer was turned and the rope tightened, strangling Troy. It was then slackened, and he caught his breath before the same thing happened again. This appears to have predominantly been done by Robert Wagner, whilst John Bunting stood over Troy, looking into his eyes and getting off on his terror. By this point, Mark Hayden had apparently left the room, as did James Vlassakis, but the latter returned and decided he needed to finish off his brother, so began to tighten the noose around his neck. It appears that Wagner also assisted, so it's unclear who actually killed Troy, but his death was determined, when his body was recovered, to have been due to strangulation. The next day, Bunting and Vlassakis went to buy another barrel and returned to the property, and Troy's body was put inside, with acid then being poured over his remains. His legs were still sticking out, so Bunting took a knife, used his skills from working in a meat factory, and cut around Troy's ankle joint, removed his foot, and threw it into the barrel with the rest of his remains, before closing the lid. So by this point there were 3 barrels stored at the property, containing the bodies of 4 people, and the stench of decomposition was becoming more and more noticeable. Bunting and Wagner drew out Troy's unemployment benefits every fortnight, and Vlassakis would lie to people about his half-brother's location in order to convince them that he was still alive. Just breaking here for a moment. So far, John Bunting and his gang had murdered 8 people. Later, we'll come back to the issue of motive. Specifically claims that these killings were apparently a crusade to eradicate the world of paedophiles. However, the last 4 murders, in my opinion, show the absolute depravity of these men, dispel any noble cause being at the root of any of this horror. Victim 9, Fred Robert Brooks, was just 17 years old when he was murdered in September 1998. Like everyone else who had been murdered, he was known to at least one of the group, and in this case, it was Mark Hayden. Fred was his wife Elizabeth's nephew and had moved to the area in late 1997 in order to be close to his family. John Bunting became obsessed with the fact that Fred was, quote, touching up little girls. There's absolutely no evidence that this is true, but Bunting kept repeating that Fred needed to die. In September 1998, Fred received notification that he'd been accepted to the Australian Air Force Cadets and was invited to a celebratory party with John Bunting, Robert Wagner and James Vlassakis on the 16th of September 1998. He promptly attended 3 Burdekin Avenue and walked straight into an ambush. Fred was beaten, handcuffed, tied up, and thumb cuffs were applied before he was forced into the bathtub where Troy Yude had been murdered just weeks before. Remember, this is a kid who'd done nothing wrong, and yet the torture he endured is absolutely sickening. Fred Brooks was interrogated by Bunting about him being, quote, dirty, because it was claimed he was a paedophile. In order to extract a confession and his banking information, Fred had lit cigarettes inserted to his ears and his nostrils. A lit sparkler was also placed into his urethra. His testicles were wired up to a mobile generator, which administered electric shocks, and bleach was also injected into his scrotum. As had become routine, Fred was forced to read out statements and phrases which were tape recorded, which could be edited together to explain his disappearance. These phrases were disparaging about his family and stated that he wanted nothing more to do with them. Like the other victims, pliers were used to crush Fred's toes. Again, Bunting stooped down so he could see eye to eye with Fred and reeled off the names of the people he'd murdered, watching the hope drain from his face. A gag was then placed in his mouth and tape wrapped around Fred's head. It's unclear how he died, but it appears he suffocated due to the gag in his mouth. Fred's body was placed in a barrel, but this time this was stored at 4 Blackham Crescent, where Mark Hayden lived with his wife Elizabeth. The other barrels had also been moved to this address, to give distance between John Bunting and his crimes. Mark Hayden was not involved in the murder of Fred Brooks, but knew what the barrels contained, and seemed to have no issue storing them. Again, the banking information was used to take money from Fred's account, until the gang's eventual arrest. Less than 2 months later, the gang would kill again. This time they targeted a local man, 29-year-old Gary O'Dwyer. His story is extremely tragic. In his early 20s, Gary was involved in a serious car crash, which left him with lifelong disabilities. He received significant trauma to his head, which meant that he was left with significant cognitive impairments. He also walked with a pronounced limp due to the physical trauma of the crash. Due to this, he was unable to work and received a disability pension. He had no family to care for him, and so lived a solitary and lonely life at 23 Francis Street, Murray Bridge, which is a road which intersects with Burdekin Avenue, where the murder gang was based. Gary was frequently seen in the local area, just trying to get on with his life, and this included being spotted by John Bunting and Robert Wagner, who would, behind his back, mock him. Bunting stated that Gary was a, quote, fag and dirty, and that he needed to, quote, go to the clinic, which was a euphemism for murder. There's no evidence that Gary was gay, or a paedophile, or anything but a vulnerable man who Bunting saw as an easy target, and, whilst he espoused his usual hate to others, he tasked Vlassakis with befriending Gary and gathering information on him, specifically how much money he had coming in, and whether he had any family. So essentially, was he worth killing, and would anyone notice his absence? Vlassakis followed the instructions and befriended their target. When it was found that Gary's murder was worth it, a quote-unquote party was arranged at his house on the 27th of October 1998. In attendance were James Vlassakis, John Bunting, and Robert Wagner. They even brought beer to complete the illusion that Gary was going to spend time with his new friends. However, what Gary did not spot was the portable generator that had been brought to the property, the same one used to torture Fred Brooks. After only 20 minutes, and without warning, Robert Wagner grabbed Gary around the neck and began to strangle him. Bunting jumped in and said, quote, "Stop, you're killing him." However, this was simply telling Wagner to stop before he went too far, as they needed to extract information from this poor man. Gary was beaten and probes attached to various parts of his body, and electric shocks applied in order to extract his bank information and to get him to record statements about the fact he was leaving the area and wanted no one to look for him. Vlassakis held Gary down whilst the other two men took the lead. Gary was tortured for hours and eventually strangled to death with a piece of rope by either Bunting or Wagner. His body was placed into a newly bought barrel and transported to the property of Mark and Elizabeth Hayden, where it was stored along with the others. John Bunting then stripped all of Gary's possessions from his home, including his furniture, which was either sold or divvied up by the murderers. Gary's sofa was later found in Mark Hayden's living room. Bunting told the neighbours that Gary had had some trouble with some local Aboriginals and had left the area due to fear for his life and would return when the heat died down. Between October 1998 and February 1999, Gary O'Dwyer's disability pension was drawn out repeatedly by the men. Victim 11, the penultimate victim, was the crime that would eventually lead to the downfall of the group, and again was an individual who had no link to any alleged sexual offences and who was extremely vulnerable. This person was 37-year-old Elizabeth Hayden, wife of Mark Hayden. Elizabeth was a woman with significant physical and intellectual difficulties, and she was also overweight, which seemed to really annoy Bunting, with him referring to her as disgusting and a waste of flesh. He would, behind Mark Hayden's back, refer to his wife as a quote, whore and lowlife. The reason for Elizabeth's murder was primarily to silence a potential witness, as Mark Hayden had told his wife about the murders, so she needed to be eliminated. This murder shows the depravity and heartlessness of Mark Hayden, as it appears that he was fully aware of the plan to murder his wife. On the 21st November 1998, Mark Hayden and Elizabeth were visited by John Bunting and Robert Wagner at their home at 4 Blackham Crescent. Eventually, Mark Hayden left the property. It seems he was fine with his wife being murdered, he just didn't want to see it happen. After he'd left, Elizabeth was attacked by Bunting and Wagner. She was dragged into the bathroom, handcuffed, and a sock forced into her mouth secured with tape around her head. She was then beaten and tortured, before eventually being strangled to death by either Wagner or Bunting, using a noose that had been placed around her neck. Her body was then taken to the shed at the back of the property and placed in an acid-filled barrel, which joined the other 5 already stored there. As I said, not much is known about Mark Hayden, but it's clear that he was just as sick as his associates, due to firstly appearing to know that his wife was going to be murdered and allowing this to happen, but when he returned to the property, he was shown his wife's remains in the barrel. When he saw her body, he simply laughed. Elizabeth's murder would be the beginning of the end. Unlike the other victims, her absence was noticed quickly, and within 3 days of her murder, her brother reported her as a missing person to the police, and they began an investigation. On the 26th of November 1998, they attended 4 Blackham Crescent and spoke to Mark Hayden about his wife's disappearance. He was edgy, but the police had no reasons to search his property at that point. Little did they know they were standing less than 50 metres from barrels containing 7 dead bodies. They left, but their involvement signified the beginning of the end, but not before one final murder. The presence of the police so soon after the murder of Elizabeth Hayden spooked all those involved, and they realised they needed to move the barrels to a new location. Initially, the 6 barrels were loaded onto the back of Mark Hayden's Land Cruiser and driven to the property of a couple that John Bunting knew in Snowtown. We shall call them Stephen and Julie. This is the first mention of the location that's become synonymous with this case. Snowtown is a quiet town, 145 kilometres or around 90 miles north of Adelaide, and only has a population of around 400 people. It's isolated. Before these crimes, most people had never heard of it. However, quickly, Bunting was asked by Stephen and Julie to move the Land Cruiser off their property due to the stench coming from the vehicle, and it was then, in January 1999, The group found an old disused bank in the town, and it was quickly decided that this property, in this out-of-the-way town, would be the perfect place to store the bodies of those already killed, but also those who would be murdered in the future. Mark Hayden and John Bunting co-signed the lease for the bank, and, along with Robert Wagner and James Vlassakis, the 6 barrels were moved into the area which used to be the bank's vault. However, a vital detail is that the Land Cruiser, although now empty, was left parked on the property of Stephen and Julie. Some of the barrels were opened, and several of the bodies cut into smaller pieces. This was likely because they had not dissolved as expected, but we'll return to this later. With the bodies out the way, no doubt the men felt as though they were likely to get away with their crimes, and so they started planning more murders. The 12th and last victim was 24-year-old David Johnson, the stepbrother of James Vlassakis. John Bunting never liked David, primarily because he was fastidious about his cleanliness and appearance, but instead of seeing this as a young man who just wished to take care of himself, Bunting described this as evidence of him being a, quote, faggot. Bunting told Vlassakis that David needed to die, and they came up with a plan to lure him to the bank. Specifically, Vlassakis was to offer his stepbrother a computer for sale, and offers to take him to see it. However, instead, he would be taken to the bank and murdered. Vlassakis agreed to the plan, and having piqued his stepbrother's interest in potentially buying a computer, on the 9th of May 1999, he drove his vehicle to the bank in Snowtown, with David following behind in his own car. The pair entered through the side door of the bank, and as soon as they walked in, David Johnson was ambushed. Robert Wagner grabbed David around the neck, and Bunting placed him in handcuffs. Bunting told David that everything was going to be okay. He just wanted to ask him some questions, and that he would be able to leave when he gave the answers, which would be in around 30 minutes to an hour. David was beaten, and flesh cut from his body using a Stanley knife in order to obtain his bank card PIN number. He was also forced to record pre-prepared statements, which would be left on answer phone messages to his friends and family to cover the murderer's tracks. The other men then left to try and take out money with the bank card, leaving Bunting and David alone. David, knowing that he was about to die, made a last-ditch attempt at freedom and charged at his captor. Johnson managed to break several of Bunting's ribs, but with his hands restrained, he was at a disadvantage, and eventually Bunting got the upper hand and was able to remove David's belt, which he then used to strangle him to death. The men then set about to, quote, slice and dice, and dismembered the body of David Johnson. However, then, as if these men were not evil enough, Vlassakis later claimed that he had seen Bunting and Wagner cooking part of David's flesh that had been cut away earlier, and eating it. David's remains were placed in one of the barrels already in the vault, meaning that there were now 6 barrels with the remains of 8 people in them. No doubt the plan was to have a steady stream of victims lured into the bank and essentially have a conveyor belt of murder and dismemberment, but the group's days were numbered. They just didn't realise it yet. By the time of the murder of David Johnson in May 1999, a major police investigation was already underway due to the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden. Police who spoke to her husband Mark Hayden in November 1998 were unconvinced by his story and noticed how nervous he was. When they returned later to make further inquiries, they were told by neighbours about a Land Cruiser being used to transport barrels, which stank. The police looked into the case more thoroughly, and in particular missing person reports in the city of Adelaide. It transpired that they were already suspicious about the men. As early as July 1998, police had become aware that Robert Wagner was withdrawing money from the account of Barry Lane, with him being caught on camera doing this. This was despite no one having seen Barry for months. Missing person reports were compiled for disappearances in the Adelaide area, and diligent police work established connections between Robert Wagner and 5 missing person cases. These were Clinton Trezise, Susan Allen, Barry Lane, Elizabeth Hayden, and Ray Davies. This was due to his personal links to these individuals, but also unusual activity on the bank accounts of some of these people, with evidence suggesting people, including him, had been taking money out long after these people had last been seen. Soon, the connection between Wagner and Bunting was established. The evidence led them to believe that Elizabeth Hayden had likely come to harm, and her disappearance was considered a major crime, which meant the police had more money and scope to act. This led to police being given the authority to tap the phones of Robert Wagner and John Bunting, which then led them to identify Mark Hayden and James Vlassakis as being part of the group. On May the 20th, 1999, Mark Hayden was followed by police as he travelled to Snowtown. As the officers were driving along, they spotted the Land Cruiser they'd been looking for, parked outside the property of Stephen and Julie. Despite the vehicle being empty, the officers noted the smell of decomposition, and when they knocked on the door, the conversation with the couple unlocked the key to everything. Stephen and Julie told the police that the Land Cruiser had been parked outside their home with barrels in it, and because they smelled so bad, they told their friend, John Bunting, to move them, and they knew that he and his friends had rented the abandoned bank in town. The police descended in force on the bank. They entered the property and progressed to the vault. They walked through plastic sheeting, which had been attached to the door frame to try to conceal the smell of death, and into a room with 6 barrels. The smell of decomposition was overpowering. Officers opened each barrel in turn and filmed the contents, and were able to establish, to their horror, that as opposed to the 5 missing people they were concerned about, they were staring at the remains of 8 people. The police acted quickly. The next day, the 21st of May 1999, John Bunting, Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden were all arrested and taken into custody. In the same afternoon, all 3 were charged with a single count of murder of a person unknown. Inevitably, this was a holding charge, while the horror of this case was being unravelled. James Vlassakis was arrested separately on the 23rd of May 1999 and immediately confessed. He spent the next 6 days telling the police everything, every murder and every detail. This allowed the police to recover the bodies of Suzanne Allen and Ray Davies at Bunting's former home at 203 Waterloo Corner Road. He was also able to correct them that the death of Thomas Trevelyan, who had been found hanging, was not a suicide, but another murder. In total, James Vlassakis gave the police details related to 12 murders. The bodies recovered were examined, and despite thinking he was very smart, as John Bunting had used hydrochloric acid as opposed to sulfuric acid, the bodies had not dissolved entirely and were mostly mummified, which meant identification of the remains from DNA, fingerprints, distinguishing features, etc. was much easier. It also meant that the catalogue of wounds to each victim could be documented, which enabled the confession of James Vlassakis to be corroborated, essentially sealing the fate of all the men. Based on this evidence, John Bunting, Mark Hayden and Robert Wagner were charged with 11 murders based on joint enterprise, which is a concept whereby, in this case, regardless of who actually killed each victim, they were all involved in creating the circumstances where they knew a person would be murdered, and so they were all equally culpable for the outcome. John Bunting was also charged separately for the murder of Clinton Trezise. James Vlassakis confessed to and was charged with direct involvement in the murders of his stepbrother David Johnson, his half-brother Troy Yude, as well as Gary O'Dwyer and Fred Brooks. All men were remanded into custody to await their day in court. James Vlassakis pleaded guilty to the 4 murders he'd confessed to at the first opportunity. On June the 21st, 2001, Vlassakis, now aged 21 years old, appeared at the South Australian Supreme Court for sentence. He was sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 26 years. This sentence was in exchange for his full cooperation with the legal proceedings of his co-defendants, including giving evidence against them. In return, James Vlassakis was being given some hope of release despite the horrific things he'd done, although this would only be after serving longer than he'd been alive by this point in prison. On August 13, 2002, John Bunting, Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden pleaded not guilty to all charges and were remanded into prison to await their trial date. Quickly, the case against Mark Hayden fell apart. They simply didn't have enough evidence to convict him of murder of any of the victims. I think it's clear that he was more involved than the court were able to prove, so he was eventually convicted of 7 counts of assisting in the murders of 7 of the victims. This primarily related to him transporting and storing their bodies. Mark Hayden was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, with him having to serve 18 years of this for his role in the Snowtown murders. On September the 27th, 2002, Robert Wagner admitted to 3 murders, those of Barry Lane, Fred Brooks and David Johnson. This was prior to the start of his trial in October of that year. I have no doubt this was tactical. I believe that Wagner was hoping that by admitting some of his crimes, he would get a sentence like Vlassakis, which would mean that he might see the light of day again. He was mistaken. John Bunting and Robert Wagner's trial started at the South Australian Supreme Court on October the 22nd, 2002. The star witness against both men was James Vlassakis. The trial lasted almost a year, and on the 8th of September 2003, the jury delivered their verdicts. As I've already stated, the jury were unable to reach a verdict on the murder of Suzanne Allen, as they could not rule out that her death was due to natural causes. However, John Bunting and Robert Wagner were both convicted of the murders of Ray Davies, Michael Gardner, Barry Lane, Thomas Trevelyan, Gavin Porter, Troy Eude, Fred Brooks, Gary O'Dwyer, Elizabeth Hayden, and David Johnson. In addition, John Bunting was convicted of the 1992 murder of Clinton Trezise. These verdicts meant that these two men are amongst the most prolific serial killers in Australian history. On October 29, 2003, both men appeared before Justice Brian Martin for sentence. Justice Martin identified John Bunting as the ringleader and addressed both men saying, quote, "Your crimes were premeditated and a number of them involved considerable planning and preparation. I'm satisfied that both of you derived pleasure from the physical act of killing and the violence and torture that preceded some of the killings. It's not an exaggeration to say you were in the business of killing for pleasure." He continued, quote, "The evidence presented during the murder trial has drawn me to the conclusion that both of you are incapable of true rehabilitation." He then sentenced them. Both John Bunting and Robert Wagner were sentenced to life imprisonment with no parole period, so they will die behind bars. As he was being led away, Robert Wagner said, quote, "Paedophiles were doing terrible things to children. The authorities didn't do anything about it. I decided to take action. I took that action. Thank you." I found very little information about the men's time in prison. James Vlassakis, now aged 43, is eligible for parole in 2025. Mark Hayden, currently 64 years old, was denied parole in 2017 and again in 2021 and remains behind bars, but his prison term expires in May 2024 and he will automatically be released at this time. With regards to John Bunting, now aged 57 years old, he appears to have accepted that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Robert Wagner is currently 51 years old and continues to try and gain his freedom. In 2019, a letter was published that he'd written to the Court of Appeal asking for a parole period to be set in his case in order to give him some chance of release. I'll read out the letter, but note the tone and content and the manipulation in Wagner's words. He writes, quote, "I'm a father of a 21-year-old son. I've been in custody since he was 18 months old and would very much like the chance to spend time with him in the community. I believe that by having a non-parole period set, this would greatly assist my mental well-being. Even if the non-parole period was lengthy, just having a date would be beneficial for me. I'm willing to undergo a psych evaluation/assessment should this be required. My behaviour in prison has been reasonably good. I'm currently a circle worker, which is a trusted position. I'm eager to continue with my good behaviour so that I can progress through the system. As part of this process, having a non-parole period set would be beneficial. I've done almost 20 years in custody, and I hope that this can be taken into consideration. I pled guilty to 3 counts of murder, which I hope to also be taken into consideration with this request." This bizarre note clearly shows that Robert Wagner does not accept the gravity of his crimes. In a lot of these murders, it seems as though it's difficult to determine who actually ended the victims' lives, but it does appear that Wagner was the one, in the majority of cases, who committed the actual murders. Him using the issue of being a parent to his son is manipulative and ridiculous. In cases where someone commits a serious offence and then bleats about the fact they won't be able to see their children, etc., my response is, well, you didn't think about that at the time, did you? Robert Wagner's son was alive at the time that he murdered David Johnson, so he must have gone home after this and held his son in the same hands that had recently held a saw, which had been used to cut up a man's body. Also, he destroyed families through his actions. Why should he be given special treatment given what he's done? I'm aware that he's not asking for release now, but the fact he thinks he ever deserves to be free again is laughable. The Court of Appeal agreed and rejected Wagner's request, and he remains in prison today, where he belongs. This is a fascinating, horrific and complex case. I'll mention the men involved, but will predominantly focus on John Bunting, the spider at the centre of the web. As a starting point, I think the most important thing in this case is to dispel any notion that the actions of anyone involved was underpinned by anything other than self-interest. Robert Wagner's claim that the group's actions were somehow a response to the police not locking up paedophiles is ridiculous and clearly an attempt to make him and his merry band of murderers seem noble when nothing could be further from the truth. To reinforce this point, it should be noted that UK forensic psychiatrist Kevin Howes, who has worked at Broadmoor Maximum Security Hospital, expressed his opinion that John Bunting was a man who lacked emotion or capacity to empathise with any of his victims, and that he fit the profile of a sadistic psychopath. Specifically, a person who enjoyed the act of torture and murdering others whilst feeling no remorse for his actions. I think this is spot on. It's also the underpinning profile of Robert Wagner, and likely Mark Hayden. I don't believe that it relates to James Vlassakis, who I'll talk about separately. However, the key thing about these comments is that each man was likely a psychopath. They had no ability to empathise or care about others, and therefore it doesn't correlate that their actions were motivated by concern for anyone else, especially not the welfare of children. The claim about this being about eradicating paedophiles is just not backed up by the evidence. Only one of the victims, Barry Lane, was actually a convicted paedophile. Also, with Barry Lane, if the motivation was eradicating paedophiles, then it seems strange that he'd be allowed to live for around 6 years before his eventual death, especially given that he was, from what I've read, quite a danger to children and more than likely to re-offend. Instead, he was kept alive because it was useful to John Bunting, and murdered to silence him, again a motive to benefit Bunting. Also, whilst 2 others had either committed offences against children or suspected of doing so, that's it. So this means for 9 victims, there was no link to paedophilia. So I think you can see, Mark Hayden's claim in court is bullshit. Instead, they were men motivated by hate, the love of killing, power and money, and would torture and murder anyone in a heartbeat. In order to understand the real motives, we need to begin by looking at John Bunting, who's at the centre of this case. As already stated, he claimed he was sexually abused when he was a child, and this he says occurred when he was 8 years old and on one occasion. Some research I've read raises some level of scepticism about his claim, with Bunting potentially trying to portray himself as a victim of paedophilia to justify the murders, which, as I've already stated, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I would tend to agree with this. However, I think more than likely, in line with so many other serial killers, Bunting was subjected to more general abuse, likely acts of violence and neglect in the family home, and this led him to grow up without any empathy, remorse or compassion for others, as well as extreme violent tendencies. Potentially this did include the sexual assault he claims, but I think, if it did occur, it compounded the effect of wider issues of abuse linked to his childhood, which are not documented. Bunting's escape from this abuse, again like so many other serial killers, was to wield control over other living things, making himself feel powerful at a time when he likely felt utterly powerless, so he began to torture animals, beginning with insects, but then progressing to killing and skinning cats and dogs. I think that Bunting enjoyed this, and found that he got a sick thrill from having the power of life and death over something living, watching life go out of their eyes, and knowing he had caused that. In terms of his views, I think that primarily John Bunting was homophobic. He despised gay people, and, as with others who hold discriminatory views of homosexuals, he equated this sexual orientation with paedophilia. So to be gay was to be a paedophile, and to be a paedophile meant you were gay. Whether these views were linked to the alleged sexual abuse he suffered is unclear, but more likely it's a reflection of the social situation at the time. During the 1970s and 1980s, the decades Bunting grew up in, the state of Queensland was ruled by the Conservative National Party, headed by John Bunting Peterson. In order to regain re-election, the topic of homophobia was used to spread fear, whilst also linking it to paedophilia. Coupled to this, you had the worldwide AIDS crisis of the 1980s, which resulted in the vilification of homosexuals across the globe. Returning to Queensland, consensual sexual acts between men was only officially decriminalised in 1991, so I think the environment that Bunting grew up in was a key catalyst to his hatred of homosexuals. A person who's homophobic often has other prejudices, as their mindset is inclined to try to elevate their own sense of importance and uniqueness by looking down on other people, and so they'll often look for differences between themselves and others in order to vilify them. So, people who are homophobic often, in my experience, have racist or sexist views, etc. This is where I think Bunting's obsession with Hitler and neo-Nazism is important. Whilst those of the Jewish faith made up the majority of those murdered during the Nazi regime, other categories of so-called undesirables were also exterminated, including the mentally and physically infirm and homosexuals. I think Bunting, given his obsession with this period of history, likely knew this, and this information, coupled with his association with people who likely shared his views, strengthened his hatred of homosexuals, but also allowed him to consider others, including the mentally ill, physically infirm, to be inferior, and therefore perfect to use and abuse, and then exterminate. So you have a man who has no remorse or empathy for others, a tendency towards acts of violence, a desire to wield power over living things, who had an underlying hatred of homosexuals, and an obsession with a regime which eliminated those considered impure on an industrial scale. I think, like others who I've covered who had an admiration for the Nazi regime, John Bunting desired that level of power, not only the ability to eliminate people at will, but also to direct others to do this on his behalf. I've no doubt that Bunting had been having fantasies about killing people long before his first murder in 1992, and he likely wished to emulate his idol, and, in order to match even a small fraction of the horror that characterised the Holocaust, he needed recruits, people who could assist him in acts of violence on the scale that he wanted. Bunting's recruitment methods and his place within the group reminds me of a cult. As I said in a recent video regarding Michael Wayne Ryan, leaders of cults are often psychopathic and motivated by power and control. They recruit followers who are vulnerable for whatever reason, and replace that feeling of powerlessness with a sense of purpose which meets their own ends. This was simply an extension of how Bunting operated in his day-to-day life. He targeted those weaker than him, who he could dominate, for example marrying a woman who had the mental age of a child. Using this template, I have no doubt that Bunting had an ability to sniff out vulnerability, to identify people who he could manipulate, and he came across Robert Wagner, a man who, unfortunately, had been abused for years at the hands of Barry Lane, a predatory paedophile, with no one apparently trying to do anything to help him escape. I imagine that Wagner felt extremely angry, abandoned and lost. John Bunting then appears in his life, and turns this completely on its head. He is in fact better than these people. They are scum, and, if you join me, I'll show you how powerful you can be. Wagner's hatred of paedophiles was, to a great extent, understandable due to the years of abuse he suffered, but it's also likely that he equated homosexuality with paedophilia. However, the abuse he suffered as a child likely meant, as with Bunting, he grew up with no empathy or remorse for his behaviour. Bunting simply nurtured something that was already there. Bunting and Wagner attended neo-Nazi rallies together, and I imagine this was part of Wagner's indoctrination to solidify his hatred of homosexuals, but also to see other types of people in society as being inferior and therefore worthy of abuse and murder. From the account of James Vlassakis, it's clear that Bunting would often speak to his followers about his hatred of paedophiles and homosexuals, although in his mind these were the same things, and I imagine he was a charismatic speaker who would lie and manipulate in order to continually reinforce his doctrine to his followers. One of these people was Mark Hayden, who, again, was a prime target due to his history of abuse, and I think the ability of Bunting to manipulate and brainwash others is shown by the fact that this man not only allowed the group to kill his wife, but when he saw her body, he simply laughed. His behaviour, in my mind, indicates a psychopathic personality, but it may also be that he had extreme cognitive difficulties, having an IQ so low that he could not grasp the seriousness of his situation. I don't have enough information to make a judgment, but it's clear that Mark Hayden was someone Bunting saw as someone he could use for his own ends. Another prime example was James Vlassakis, a child who had had a horrific upbringing, who was desperate for love and attention and acceptance from someone who was not going to abuse him. However, John Bunting continued this cycle and turned this child's vulnerability to his advantage, again filling his head with hate so that he would be complicit in the horrors to come. Like everyone else in Bunting's life, James Vlassakis was only there to be of use to him. I think the murder of Troy Ude is significant. This was not, in my opinion, born out of any concern for James Vlassakis or an act of retribution for his suffering. No, I think that when Bunting heard about Troy abusing Vlassakis as a child, he instantly heard homosexual in his head, and therefore he wanted him to die because of his own prejudices, but it was also a test. Troy could easily have been killed without the input of Vlassakis, but he was woken and told to come and join in. I think that Bunting, and likely Wagner, wanted to see what Vlassakis would do. If he participated, he also had blood on his hands and was one of them. If he did not, he would have been eliminated. Vlassakis did participate, but I think, had he not, his name would have been on the list of victims in this case. However, even if the plan had been originally to kill homosexuals, it became clear as time progressed that murder was used to gain access to money, eliminate witnesses, and eliminate those that Bunting considered inferior for any number of reasons, or who simply pissed him off. The issue of money doesn't seem to be highlighted much in what I've read, but I think it is a relevant factor. The group pocketed around 90,000 Australian dollars in benefits payments from their victims, which today is around 170,000 Australian dollars, which is equivalent to about £93,000 or around $115,000. Whilst this may not have been the primary motive of this spree, it seems to have been at the heart of at least one murder, that of Gary O'Dwyer, with James Vlassakis being tasked with finding out whether killing him was worth it financially. This again simply shows the complete lack of humanity regarding John Bunting. Everyone in his life was to be used and abused, whether this was to get off on the power of killing them or to line his own pockets. And this is the essence of this group. It was all about John Bunting. I can envisage Bunting imagining himself on a throne as a king, or a god, or a dictator, who, when he had the urge to kill, pointed his finger at someone and ordered their murder, with his minions carrying out his orders without question. This was the most important motivation of all, directing others to do his bidding, as well as the torture and murders themselves, which was something that Bunting enjoyed. It reinforced his sense of power and allowed him to live out his fantasies of superiority, with him going so far as to get his victims, in their last moments, to essentially grovel at his feet, whilst he looked into their eyes as they took their last breath. His claims about paedophilia and homosexuality, I think, were predominantly, especially towards the end, simply used to get his followers into a fervour, so they would carry out his orders. No doubt, if he hadn't been stopped, the bank vault in Snowtown would have been piled high floor to ceiling with barrels, the output of a production line of murder. However, I think James Vlassakis was different. Despite his involvement in this horrifying case, I have a great deal of sympathy for him. His whole life, from his childhood to his incarceration, was characterised by abuse, going from one predator to another. It doesn't appear, from what I've read, that Vlassakis ever really stood a chance. To be very clear, a difficult childhood of any degree does not excuse taking the life of others, but I hope that his full confession, guilty plea, and his acceptance of his punishment are indicators of some level of remorse for his actions, and that, when he's eventually released, he tries to do some good with the rest of his life. This case has taken me ages to research and put together. I hope that I've done it justice. Please let me know your thoughts on this interesting but terrifying series of murders. If you like the content, please consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, which is £2.99 a month, or around $4. You get early access to videos and an icon next to your name, which changes from bronze to silver to gold. Also, consider sending a super thanks, which is a one-off payment to support the channel. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.